This is a conversation about a really important mission to improve health and safety. It's also about extreme difficulty, persistence, and how being professional, in inverted commas, might actually mean straying far outside your one specific professional domain. Hey, it's Andrew, and this is Safety on Tap. Since you're listening in, you must be a leader wanting to grow yourself and drastically improve health and safety along the way. Welcome to you. You're in the right place. If this is your first time listening in, thank you for joining us, and well done for trying something different to improve. And of course, welcome back to all of you wonderful regular listeners. Today, my guest is Gareth Lock. Gareth doesn't easily fit in a box or under a single label, as you'll hear in a moment. Military, flying, human factors, hop, diving, and more. I've wanted to bring a conversation to you with Gareth for a while for three reasons. The first one is the people that I know and trust have said wonderful things about him, and I value that. Second, he is generous. His writing, his travel, his courses, and social media contribution are a cut above the rest. Just following him on LinkedIn is like a 3-month mini course all on its own. And third, Gareth is tackling some wicked problems in the health and safety space. And I had to see what lessons he is learning from what is very tough work. Here's Gareth. Gareth Lock, welcome to the Safety on Tap podcast.
Thank you very much for the invite. Really looking forward to it. Great to chat to you again.
Absolutely. So for people who don't know you, what's the 30-second summary? Gareth, what do you do? Who are you?
Great question. What do I do? I am probably known for all the work that I do in the diving space, trying to bring human factors, hot psychological safety, just culture into originally the sports diving space, but now working in military scientific areas. But also anywhere that there's teams who want to improve, who want to have a mirror held up against them and may not like what they see, but that's what their journey is about.
Maybe you got to work on that last bit with the marketing, but I totally understand the difference between what people might want and maybe what they need. So tell me this, why diving? Why work in diving?
So a number of years ago, while I was going through my Air Force career, I went on holiday, couldn't sit on the beach, do nothing. So I went to learn to dive. That was 99, then didn't dive for 5 years, had a near miss in the States, and wanted to share my story to the diving community as is the norm for the military aviation and aviation community in general. And I couldn't find an easy way of sharing that story. So since 2005, I've really been interested in how and why people make the decisions they do, trying to bring what in effect is crew resource management into the diving space. And it's a really quite immature space. It's where aviation was probably 50 or 60 years ago. You're last to touch
60,
it.
say.
Oh yeah, 50 or 60 years ago. It is very immature. It's really fractured. There's no real leadership as such. There are intentional air gaps between organizations and the operational space because the organizations don't want to be responsible for what happens in a discretionary activity. And that causes tensions in terms of organizational learning. And that's, it's when you come from a space where learning and sharing stories is the norm into a high risk environment, which is austere and inherently hazardous, and the way that risk is presented, it jars quite a lot. It's a fun, exciting activity, but you're inherently in a non-life sustaining environment. And there's a lot of education needed.
Wowzers. So you're obviously a man up for a challenge.
Yes. And it's really, about a week or so ago, I had a bit of a rant on LinkedIn and deleted the post afterwards, but it was just this bit of, okay, so those who operate in highly regulated environments, who've got structured organizations, you've got leadership. Okay, tell me how you operate in a globally diverse environment where there is no leadership. People don't want to learn.
Yeah.
And risk is basically, oh, you tried that. You tried that. You tried that. Yeah. And where I am now is very much in the complexity space of trying to nudge people, create stories. Dave Snowden in the Kinevin framework talks about more stories like this and less stories like that.
Yeah.
And it's a trajectory, middle stroke bottom up rather than top down, because top down, there's very limited interest in bringing human factors and system safety into an organization or a domain that doesn't really get it.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Now, at the risk of blaming the customer for not engaging with what we've got, I'm going to put my black hat on to borrow De Bono's
Mhm.
thinking hats. So you've got a background in aviation, spent some time in the Air Force, human factors as well. You mentioned crew resource management as one of those examples, not the only thing, but a good example of how the aviation industry attempted to standardize and normalize things like communication in the cockpit and speaking truth to power and all of the other
Mhm.
things people, kind of use who haven't been involved in, and I haven't,
Yeah.
so I'm speaking as an outsider. Um, Tell us a little bit about your thought process that you went through when you went, well, that's kind of how I'm used to operating, but I want to work in this space with these types of people. And you've just described all of the reasons why they're not the same. Structural reasons, market shape reasons, user customer reasons, the types you mentioned, different types of diving that I imagine
Mhm.
are different in different ways. So can you talk us through how you went through the logic of why something that works in aviation is going to work in a space like diving?
It's a really interesting bit, and it's one of the reasons why people rarely learn from incidents and accidents, because they try to find the differences, not the similarities.
Okay, go on.
So the bit there where I'm building on that is the fact that we're operating in an austere environment. So where decisions have to be correct, where we're trying to operate as a team, as a shared mental model. So
Yeah,
as an instructor teaching a bunch of students in a class,
yeah,
there is an authority gradient straight away.
yeah,
They are a learning team, and the instructors need to learn about leadership. And that's not taught in that environment. So there's probably more parallels than differences, and the differences are easier to spot. So conceptually, what we're trying to get, and my view of crew resource management is really about creating a shared mental model within the team
huh?
so they know what's happening now and what's going to happen next and how to predict and monitor and the whole sort of piece about resilience. So to me, that's where I'm trying to get into space. Trying to create change in those environments is very different. And actually, a colleague of mine works in the healthcare space, and he said, we think it's hard when we've got it in healthcare, but at least we've got organizational structures and we've got roles and we know where things are. In the diving space, it's about social change rather than structural change. And where I'm working at the moment is those who have got an intrinsic motivation to improve and get better. And then they're passing it on to others. So in effect, working with ambassadors, to a certain extent names, but some of the names don't get it either.
Mm,
So it's that bit that says, actually, if they can mandate simple training
mm,
prior to their own technical skills training, then we can start to change the language.
mm.
And again, it's this whole bit of actually, this is a systems problem that needs to be resolved, not just a structural bureaucratic process that needs to be put in place.
Yeah,
Because
awesome.
ultimately, the organizations need to work out how to make money from this. And it doesn't make money. It's not directly anyway.
Yeah. So let's just, I might pause a couple of times
Yeah,
just
yeah,
to
go for it.
what you mean by certain things, just so that we're on the same page and the listeners are
Yeah,
too.
sure.
But when you talk about the organizations, what do you mean by that?
So the training organizations like PADI, SSI, INTD, SDI, TDI, these are the training organizations who write the training materials to go to, in effect, train the trainers who train instructors, and the instructors then train diving clients. Now, one of the challenges in the diving space is you have a training silo, a training column, and then you have the fun diving that happens. And
Fun.
there is an intentional disconnect between the recreational activity that people go out and they go on a shore dive or they get on a boat and they go diving, and the training system. And and that's what my thesis recently has been about, is how do you transfer learning between a structured environment and an unstructured environment?
Yeah.
When the structured environment's not interested about what happens in the unstructured space, and the structured space is very much about compliance, following the process, following the rules for fear of litigation. And that means that actually you're not necessarily preparing instructors and divers to dive out in the real world.
Yeah, 100%. I can appreciate that disconnect. And either way, they're going to be making it up as they go. So if they're out to make a quick buck, then I imagine that you've got problems with that. And then you've also got organizations who are trying to do the right thing, but find it difficult to do that because it's not normalized. It's not what people expect. It's because they're in a hurry to get in the water and all of those kinds of factors as well. For the listeners, I just wanted to pause because I'm fascinated by you, pun intended, swimming around in this particular change problem. I don't know many other people like that. And I don't know whether you, I don't know what you'll think when I say this, but when I reflect on what I know about your work and what you've told me, I think of Ignaz Semmelweis. Have you heard of Ignaz
Yeah.
Semmelweis?
Oh, yes. I've drawn that parallel with me several times.
So for the listeners who haven't heard, I'll link to the podcast episode I did on Ignaz Semmelweis, who was the guy who effectively proved to doctors, to clinicians, that it was a good idea to wash their hands or go to the morgue before they went and delivered babies, and that would reduce mortality in mothers and babies. He got committed to a mental asylum because he went against the grain of the medical profession, didn't make any friends in the process, and then got beaten to death. Well, not beaten to death. He got very badly beaten and then died as a result of his injuries in that mental asylum. And then it took another 100 or so years before the profession actually went, you know what, this washing hands is a good idea. So
Yeah.
now that we've covered that off for the listeners, give us a bit of an indication about what has it been like in the earliest moments of change for when you started to have these conversations? Because it sounds like you're talking to people who haven't woken up this morning and gone, you know what, we need to slow down, learn more, get more consistent, share. Like they're not waking up with those problems in their mind. So give us a sense of what it sounds like when you're talking to people who didn't want what you've got.
So I first started delivering classes January 16. So I wrote a white paper in 2011, which basically compared incident reporting in the UK using HFACS, the Human Factors Analysis Classification System framework. And I burnt a lot of bridges. I upset quite a few people at that stage because I basically said the incident reporting system you've got is flawed. It doesn't actually help learning. It focuses on the outcomes and the severity of the outcomes, and it doesn't look at processes.
So I
So,
think the would be you kind of pooped in the nest.
sorry?
You
All
pooped
right, yeah.
in the nest.
Oh, totally. And so what was interesting is that a couple of the recreational agencies, they were the ones with the biggest pushbacks and said, look, that's rubbish. That, diving is safe-ish, but our reporting systems work. And why do we need to report anyway? The technical diver agencies who were more involved in deeper wreck diving, using different gases, helium-based gases, longer exposures, thought, you know what, there's something here. And so over a number of years, I started a PhD at Cranfield and then stopped it because it wasn't going anywhere. And part of that's because I was teaching. And my first 2 pilot classes, people went, you know what, this is really good stuff. I have no idea how you're going to market it. And so these people recognize the value of the training. And it's basically been chipping away. And pretty much everybody who comes into the program, I've probably trained 500 plus people face to face now. I would say maybe 2 or 3 of those people have gone, nah, I didn't get anything out of it. The rest have gone, we need this. And the problem is diving is presented as a relatively safe sport. Numerically, there's about 200 people die a year, but they're in 1s, maybe 2s, but it doesn't have the same emotional value. And so there's this constant pushback of going, we're safe. We don't need to change anything. But perversely, because it's got a really immature, toxic environment when it comes to talking about near misses, there is a huge number of stories out there. They're not fatals, so they don't get counted, but there are lots of things that happen. And so it's trying to get people to recognize that this is it. And when people come into a program, they go, yes, this is what we need to do. How on earth are we going to deploy it?
Yeah.
Because we're already in an established system. how do you go about, you could deploy a change program, like some education at the sharp end to the divers and the diving instructors down at the delivery end.
Yep.
But now you've got to educate your instructors to know what the materials are about.
Yeah.
So you can't just have your students knowing as much as the instructors do, or more, as the case may be.
Sure.
You also have to have organizational buy-in. And from their point of view is they're just like any commercial entity trading off between money and risks and what are they doing. And this doesn't help organizational value
Yeah.
because of the way that risk is managed.
Yeah.
So those who are open-minded, who want to grow and learn, and those who've had a near miss, who, a genuine was close,
Yeah.
right? They recognize the value of this and go through the training, which is highly experiential, and we get people thinking differently. You go, yes, we need this. But those who haven't, and those who live in the darkness, that work is imagined work is done gap.
Yeah.
Well, we don't hear anything, therefore everything must be okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there are so many parallels between diving and the corporate space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of thinking errors there. When you say,
Mm.
just give us a bit of a sense for people who are non-divers, what does a non-fatal, serious near miss look or sound like? Like, paint a picture for us.
Yeah, so it could be that you have been distracted, or the planning for the gas consumption wasn't as it should be, and you end up running out of gas at the bottom. You look down at your pressure gauge and it's low, your buddy's over here, and you bolt to the surface. Now, your body is pretty physiologically resilient, so it can take a lot of stress, but sometimes you get decompression sickness, which is like turning the cap on a Coke bottle and all the bubbles come out of a solution.
Yep.
That's what happens in your body at a much smaller level. So it's not very good. So decompression is one of them. Entanglements or getting lost in wrecks, caves. And so often people don't realize they've had an event because they surface and they've had a great time. It's exciting, but they don't reflect on how close they were to the margins of failure that are.
Because they don't the basis of the actual outcome.
Yes. Yeah, totally. And here's the conflict that exists in diving is we want it to be adventurous. We want it to be exciting. We want it to be exploration. And so now we've got an intentional risk injection into the decision-making process.
Yeah.
So those could be that stuff that's coming to the surface now, no pun intended, immersion pulmonary edema. So where you actually drown from the inside because of pressure is secreting fluid into the lungs. And people have thought it was, as more research has been done, they've realized that this is a thing that needs to be dealt with. And the problem is there's not a lot you can do about it in terms of screening or in terms of detection is when you realize that you can't breathe very well. And hopefully you don't have a decompression overhead, which is where you can't surface straight to the surface. So, could be sort of sea life or sea animal injuries, but most of the stuff is relatively minor. And then it takes a big step.
Sure.
And as with any sort of safety thing, the gap between near miss and fatal is not very big. It doesn't take a lot to step you over that.
Right.
And invariably people in hindsight turn around and go, oh, I should have paid more attention. I should have been better. I should have communicated. I should, a whole raft of counterfactuals. And so the learning often gets missed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that. So I also kind of wanted to just zoom out a little bit and pick up for the listeners about how many concepts that you've talked about so far or that have come into our conversation. So we've used a little bit of metaphor and some other concepts. Work as imagined, work as done. We've talked about how close you are to the edge or the boundary or limit of risk, whatever you want to call it, and that there's not a lot of space between where you are normally operating and then very serious consequences. So, and I've got a few more about complexity. You've talked about shared mental models. So I'm really curious, what have you learned about the way that you've put some of these ideas together and then the way that you help other people understand them? Because some of them are pretty, ethereal, gray, fluffy. So talk to us a little bit about Gareth, the sense maker and the communicator, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you're right. There's a lot of things and people go, what on earth are you talking about, Gareth? This, it doesn't make sense. And the easiest way is to tell a story.
Okay.
And that's where I suppose the biggest change or the biggest impact that I've had is using a documentary called If Only.
Okay.
And it tells the story of a diving fatality through the lens of human factors and just culture. And just culture is another concept that we recognize that people are fallible, they're going to make mistakes. And so let's look at the context and their decision-making process. So that story and the exercise that I run in online programs or workshops is I give people a fairly simple question. And I ask them, basically, why do you think, or I tell them a scenario, maybe 2 or 3 sentences. Why do you think this happened? What was the cause of it?
Yeah.
And people will come back with very simple narratives, very judgmental narratives. And then we play through the video. And then I say to them, we stop about 2/3 of the way through before I start doing the analysis in the video. And then I say, okay, so what do you think are the reasons for this now? What are the contributory factors? And then they'll write a whole bunch more, which are different to the first column. And then we do the analysis piece, the last sort of 10 minutes of the video. And they say, right now, what do you think the causes are and the contributory factors and the context that's there? And then we start a discussion. And so one of the, most powerful ways of doing it is telling stories and getting people to reflect on it.
Yeah.
Even when I go into, just recently done some work, about 2/3 of the way through a media company, underwater media company, doing some training for them. I've got a case study from the book that I put together, which has got 30 plus stories in it. And one of the case studies is a media shoot. And I present this story and I say, okay, so identify the decision-making processes in there, how it made sense for that diver to do what they did. And invariably, people pick it up and go, God, what a nightmare. I wouldn't be involved. I hope this isn't our company that was involved, and become very judgmental. And then we start talking through the story and they go, oh yeah, we do that. Oh yeah, that's a parallel with us. And so it's about trying to dig into their initial rationalization of it, where we immediately jump into the counterfactuals, the could have, should have, would have, the simple solution as to why the event occurred.
Yeah.
And then we start digging into the complexity, the emergence of failures, and the emergence of success.
Yeah.
And then they realize, oh, this is not a simple linear cause and effect thing. There's a whole bunch of other bits.
Yeah.
And then I say to them, okay, so where's the relevance in your space? Where do you draw the parallels? And that's, to me, the key piece out of the learning, whether or not I'm doing analog simulations using Planks or Jenga or the Interlab tool that I use, the computer-based simulation. It's about getting them to reflect on the parallels of this activity and their own workspace and how they can close those gaps.
Right. So you said 2011 is when you got your dive. You did your first time.
Yeah, I put the white paper. Well, so 2005 is when I had my near miss. 2011 is when I wrote the white paper.
Okay, cool.
2016 is when I started teaching.
So let's say 2011 is when this earworm got into you and it hasn't left.
Yeah.
So in that time, what have you seen? So let's spend a little bit of time on the success side of the ledger. What kinds of things have you heard, seen that give you an indication that maybe things could be heading in the right direction because of the work that you're doing?
I think the biggest one is the change in language and the fact that there are people out there who are asking the questions, making the points that I was, but don't necessarily need to do so now. Yeah. So one of, the great bits is, oh, you sound just like Gareth Lock. Cool. I have no idea who you are, but actually that message and that mindset and the nudging that's going on. And when I first gave my I gave my first conference presentation in 2012, there were 5 people in the room. And now I can get, a couple of hundred people. And that's, it's getting people to think differently, and people coming up to me going, you know what, this is a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
That there's now 12,000 people in the Facebook group that I've got. And it's just, and actually that's one of the hardest bits for me, is sustaining that motivation, because the change happens out there.
Yes.
And it's only when somebody goes, oh yeah, Gareth, this is what I've done. Thanks very much for everything you do. you get that reverse feedback or that feedback and you go, yes, I
Yeah.
have influenced that person. Or somebody's come back from a dive trip and they said, had it not been for your book, I'd probably be dead now because
Wow.
now I thought about, oh yeah, I mean, getting those things back is really, really good. And the ability to influence investigations now, moving from the last to touch it to say, right, we need to include some narrative around context and human factors.
Yep.
But we don't know the answers. I know, but at least ask the questions in the sort of the narrative that you put out there.
Yeah. Wow. First of all, kudos, because, it's very hard, I think, for people like us to say, I can confidently claim that maybe I've saved a life. It sounds like you've got almost direct
Mm,
feedback for that
yeah.
without having your hands directly in the water with people, so to speak. So for that, I thank you, and plenty of people do as well. Hey, it's Andrew with a quick reflection about performance. No one wakes up in the morning thinking, I wish I had a coach for work. So it's pretty normal that coaching isn't a concept that's on your mind. What I do know is from working with hundreds of health and safety professionals, what's more likely to be in your mind are the frustrations you might be feeling about making change, or the doubts you have about your ability to step up, or concerns you have about the capability of your team to better service the needs of your organization. Or maybe you're excited but unsure about your new promotion, that expanded responsibility, or how in the heck you'll develop and deliver that new health and safety strategy. These are the everyday things in the game of health and safety practice. Some good, some not so good. A coach is not on the field of play with you. They don't pass you the ball and tell you what to do. A coach helps you be ready for the game, to prepare a plan, to develop the skills or the capabilities for the next challenge, and support you through the losses as well as the wins. Coaching is not evaluated on your participation or the time spent. Coaching is only evaluated on its outcomes for you, and they can be pretty awesome. Coaching is one of the most effective forms of professional development I've ever seen. I have a long list of stories and people who I can put you in touch with to tell you exactly how they've benefited from coaching with me. And it's a pretty smart investment in valuable resources for you and your team. If you want to explore how coaching might help accelerate you and your team's success, visit www.safetyontap.com/curious. So give me a bit of a sense then about when you're putting these concepts together, you're trying to kind of paint a picture of a way of looking at the world, some lenses or perspectives to take that don't come naturally. Like you said, we often seek to blame. We often just focus on the event and not out. So what concepts or ideas or theories or models have had the most impact on you? Have you had any real light bulb moments when you've gone, if I put those two things together, or if I take that idea and I inject it at this point in the explanation or the story, or the training, is there anything that's had a really significant impact on you, making this change?
I'd probably say Jens Rasmussen's tensions model, so the dynamic risk management, where you've got safety, resource, and people, time, money, and understand that you're always in a tension in there, and that's where that sort of how close you are to the failure line. And I often use that as a way of trying to get people to recognize that your biggest bang for buck is where you're making the most of your money and your resource, but it also is your least safe, but you
Yeah.
don't know where it is.
Yeah.
And that works at an individual level. It works at a team level. It works at an organizational level. That there's always these tensions in place. And we only know where that accident line is when we step over it and we go, oops, whoops, kind of, yeah. And that's it. And the more I read about things, the classic bit, the less I realize I know. I'm
Mhm.
just reading some stuff from Dylan and Tinsley talking about near misses and the difference between, and Ben Hutchison just posted a paper about this. I'd got them put them into my thesis, but I'm rereading them because of Ben posting. And it was this bit that near misses that could have happened are treated as successes as opposed to near misses that almost happened. And so we end up rewarding people for those getting away with could have happened
Yeah.
near misses.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
so you sit there and go, Sorry?
I was about to say it's like the and again, I don't know whether there's a often theoretical way to describe this, but I kind of talk about it like the hero complex. You know,
Mhm.
like you're an idiot if you run into a burning building and you die. You're a hero if you run into the burning building and you come out. Um,
Yes.
and you've got very little control over the, the outcome.
Yeah. Well, I use in the trainings, I use Sully in exactly that piece about ditching on the Hudson,
Yeah.
and changing the checklists, ditching there. And had he crashed into the tower blocks, would he have gone from hero to villain?
Yeah.
And where the more powerful, the more emotional the story, the disparity between hero and villain in that sense.
Yeah.
And then saying, okay, so what does the community, what do the organizations reward? And in the diving space, it's often about exploration. We have I'm going to say a real problem. I believe we have a problem with things like the GoPro culture,
Mhm.
that people only see the very short snippets. They don't see all of the blood, sweat, tears, literally, to get to that space.
Yeah.
And so people go, I want to do that. And we can buy a piece of equipment. We can go and do stuff, push the boundaries. And because equipment is pretty reliable, people have no idea how close they are to that boundary of failure.
Sure.
And they get away with it, go, awesome. And actually, because reflection and debriefs and after action reviews are not the norm, people don't look back and go, actually, what's the quality of that decision making versus, the outcomes that were there?
So paint a picture for us. In my mind, I feel like I've got this bifurcation, this binary approach to you've described recreational diving. So that's crazy people like me who like abalone, and I'm more than happy to go deeper to get it. Although I've only ever free dived. And then you've got technical diving. Sorry, you said technical diving before, but the other category that's in my mind is guys who are on oil rigs in the middle of the ocean,
All
or
right. Yeah.
being, you know, people who are, oceanographers who are scientists.
Yes.
So I kind of feel like I've got, and I'm declaring a bias here, I've got this kind of distinctly occupational context and then the recreational context. First of all, what are your thoughts on me putting those two buckets out? And then second of all, if they are two fair buckets to use, what are the differences? What are the similarities between them in terms of how your work is received?
So you're right. There is almost like a sports bucket,
Mhm.
and then it's occupational. And the occupational covers scientific diving, military diving, commercial diving. And the commercial diving spreads from people who are working in ditches inland versus saturation divers offshore. So there's a huge spectrum of risk exposure that's going on in the recreational sports space, which includes free diving, which has got a bunch of risks involved. You go from the free diving space to technical diving, where people are going regularly 100 meters plus and several kilometers back into a cave system. So you've got that sports area, and then you've got the commercial side. The big difference is how, I would say, risk is managed in a paperwork way.
Okay.
So in the sports space, there is no structured risk management process that's in place. And I don't believe we manage risk in the sports space. I think we manage uncertainties. And those are managed through biases and heuristics and mental shortcuts. Whereas in the commercial space, there is a structure and there is a duty holder who has a responsibility to make sure that the activity for those people at work is safe. And I'm reading Greg Smith's latest book, Proving Safety, and talking about actually the conflict that exists there of operational safety versus legislative safety.
Sure.
So in the commercial space, there is a structure, but it's also very much about compliance. So none of the regulators have said you are to put human factors training processes in place. The IOGP for the oil and gas sector in 2014, 15, because that's when I was doing work out in the Middle East, put together documents 501, 502, 503, which were about crew resource management in the oil and gas sector. But that hasn't flowed down into the commercial diving space. The clients, the primary clients, haven't said, you are to do this.
Oh.
And the subcontractors and the individual divers are going, why would I invest money in my own development when I don't need to do it? So So there's less intrinsic motivation freedom in the commercial space to get better
Mm.
because it relies on a compliance type framework. There's more intrinsic motivation in the sports space, but again, it's very much about compliance. And as long as you complete a certification course, you must be safe when you go diving because, hey, I've got a certification that allows me to do this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So tell me, I mean, what can we, let's zoom right out. What can we learn from, I mean, unfortunately, from, these incidents and fatalities? You said that there are some incident reporting systems out there. Do you assume that coroners from time to time would be having a look at this? I wonder whether, occupational regulators, look at it as well, or is it a too small a number?
So there's a couple of things. So in the sports diving space, the industry is self-regulating
Mhm.
in that it has a body, the Recreational Scuba Training Council, who set the standards which the training agencies then inherit. But the bodies that inherit the standards are sitting on the RSTC. So, and it's a unanimous voting body as well. So there's no real incentive to bring additional safety protocols in place. And because it's a self-regulating business, the occupational regulators like WorkSafe or the Health and Safety Executive, they delegate that responsibility down to the training agencies to manage their own safety and their own quality management. So unless somebody is at work and they breach at work regulations, that's when they're interested. If they breach agency training standards, the regulator's not interested. That's a training agency issue.
Yeah.
And the problem is there is very poor quality management. It's predominantly tick sheets that basically, did you have a good course? There's no real active quality management auditing that goes out. And as long as in effect you pay your annual fees and you say you've updated your books, you're free to teach one another. There's no real requalification process that happens.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that society just thinks that this is okay? It's not a problem that needs to be solved, Gareth. Is that a fair statement?
I am the pain in the ass that's out there. They're going, what are you doing this for?
Yeah.
Because, in fact, there's a slide at a presentation I gave in Malta a year ago now, where I put on there and said, safety is not a technical issue. It's a moral, ethical issue.
Mhm.
And I put on there and said, fundamentally, there are not enough dead divers to create change. And that didn't go down very well, understandably. But, there's one of my tutors at Lund. He talked about for change to happen, there has to be a politically relevant event. And in aviation, there were a number of those seminal events at Tenerife and East Midlands. In oil and gas, Macondo, Deepwater Horizon, Piper Alpha, healthcare, there's been loads of reports. And so we have these big spotlight themes. But in diving, it's ones, twos. It's no different than general aviation in the States. 350, 400 people die a year in light aircraft crashes in the States, but it's ones and twos. But if
Yeah.
you crash 3 regional jets every year in the States, there'd be a bit of a different change.
Yeah. I think that's a really good pickup because we, the listeners, are able to learn from you at kind of two levels about how are you teaching and making change for the people you're seeking to serve, but also what can we take out of that macro change process that you're part of and in some sense, struggling with too.
Mm.
I mean, have you, I was about to ask one of those, have you tried this question, Spade?
Try it, see what happens.
Oh, I don't know. No. Let me rethink it. What I'm really curious about is, I mean, you mentioned mental models before. You've talked about complexity. One of the things that helps us think about complex situations is the fact that we're all in a system. And I think it was Derek Cabrera who talked about the idea that there's no such thing as even context. So
Mm.
this is going to be a circuitous route, but I'm going to get to my question. So for the listeners, we're really familiar with risk management standards saying that the first step is not to identify what could go wrong, but to actually establish the context. And the clever complexity people are kind of saying, no, stop talking about context because it's like it's something. It's not a thing. Context is everything. And let's just call that the system. And when we say system, we mean little s system, not safety management systems, not digital stuff. It's like the fact that you and I are talking and we're both male and we both live in Western societies and we're both wearing a black shirt and we're speaking English. And you're now
Yeah.
laughing at the fact that I said that these are all parts of the system that we're in. It's the fish that's swimming around in water every single day and doesn't know what the ocean is. So my very circuitous route to my question is going back to those parts of the system that you've tried to influence. And I'm sure that the listeners are thinking, well, the answer, Gareth, is just more regulation, or the answer is that we need to shine a spotlight more on the fatalities, or the answer is so like let's zoom right out to the big picture stuff. Forget your training or whatever for the moment. Forget the bottom up stuff. What are the systemic kind of levers that you've had a crack at, or where do you think there are difficulties in having a go at those?
Insurance companies tried that.
Mhm.
And their argument is, where's the evidence that doing this training would make a difference in diving? It's like, there is no evidence because nobody's doing it at the moment. However, if you look at other spaces, there
Yeah.
are improvements that can be had.
Yeah.
Trying to, at the organizational level, the organizations trying to work out how do they fit this in, because it's going to take them time. And so recognizing that actually trying to do top down straight away is not going to work.
Okay.
So where I've been doing a lot of stuff is actually blogs, social media, presentations, generally raising the language awareness or the awareness of the language that's
Yeah.
there, that whole piece about words change worlds.
Yeah.
And getting people to move from, even we don't even have 5 whys in the diving space. People just have one. And just trying to move away. Yeah, exactly. And getting involved with other people who influence. So in July, there's a couple of guys who run a YouTube channel called Dive Talk. And I'm going out as part of, they've invited me to be a speaker at their session. And I've spoken to them about this. I have a tension with how they present events, because often they make fun of the people that are there
Yeah.
about what's going on. And I say, look, that reduces the learning. So I was in this bit of, do I go out there and they don't, they make me feel uneasy. But at the same time, there's now 200 people who want to learn, who I can now influence. So there are times where you have to suspend your own, not totally, partially suspend your values because the greater value is worth doing.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a key thing.
I think again, I really appreciate what you're teaching us by sharing, because that highlights. I mean, I wouldn't say that you're compromising. I wouldn't talk about it so negatively.
Mm.
I would instead frame it in a way that says that you're really clear about the big goal. The phrase that has come up a couple of times in recent coaching sessions with clients of mine is you got to pick which hills to die on because you only get to die once. So
Yeah.
now that is not in disrespect of people who have served, certainly, but it's metaphorically, which battles are you going to take on and which ones are you not going to? And I also appreciate too that I'm sure that you're having this wrestle in your head about, well, what are the trade-offs of that? What might happen if I let that one go to the keeper?
Yeah.
Then how is it going to play out? So I I appreciate that.
When I've got an example of that, picking your battles, about, thanks to some coaching I've had, about 8 weeks ago, I turned around and said, you know what? I'm no longer going to chase the training agencies to put materials in their stuff.
Yeah.
They know who I am. They know what I've got. And that's one of the reasons I put the THD together, so they can start developing their own stuff. If they want it, they can come and pay for it, but I'm not going to go and hound them and say, do this. So that's a battle that I'm not going to do. I'm going to go somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the word, you said people who influence, and I'm glad that you said that because you didn't say the influencers, although maybe they're synonymous in a social media sense. But I appreciate that you drew me quite gently back to the idea that bottom up is the strategy here. If we talk about a Rogers adoption curve, it sounds like you are absolutely on the left-hand tail with not just the early adopters, but the bit before that, whatever they call that bit.
Yeah. The innovators. Yeah.
Innovators. Yeah. Yeah. So tell me, let's talk a little bit about that. So we've now clearly framed your change process is focused on the few who hopefully will start to move more people and then hopefully get to move the many. You're not trying to be in control of all of that, but you're trying to borrow influence, borrow audience and attention, uh, plant people with seeds will germinate new kinds of language that you're hearing back. So that's kind of the approach you're taking. So tell us a little bit about how you've used those early adopter, innovator type people. Sorry, used is not the right. How have you interacted
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
in the change process?
Um, so it's about getting them, they said, can we do some training? We get some training done. And they've gone, right, we like this. How do we get that out there to influence their students and their instructors? And actually, I'm going to say a mandated program. I charge them a small amount, a lot less than the course is worth. And they mandate it as part of pre-learning. And so now they are educating future leaders, future divers. And so there's a couple of guys, at least, who've now got instructors who've gone through, or instructor candidates who've gone through their programs, who now value it so much, they're mandating it in their instructor programs as well. So the tiers are growing as they happen. And it's just the continual education piece. It's giving them value as best I can. What is it that I can do to make it easier for them?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that they are, I think, starting to influence the organizations under which they sit.
Yeah.
If you turn around and go, hang on a minute, we've got really successful instructors, really successful shops. What is it that they see in this? And can we get a part of it?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's a term that Seth Godin uses of sneezers. And I'm trying to find the sneezers, the virus. And I'm very conscious of which people I'm using, approaching, supporting when it comes to influencers, because there are some very big social media influencers who don't meet my standards.
Yeah.
They're very much about look at me type things, as opposed to the quality. And it's the quality influencers that I'm looking at, not the visual influencers.
Yeah, amazing. I love that. And I think, picking up on Seth Godin's quote about sneezes, the idea of memetics, like genetics, which is that we have evolution because certain ideas tend to spread quicker, like a virus would spread. And those things persist over time. They change shape and they evolve. And I think that's very, very clever. I wonder how many listeners are listening to this going, oh, I didn't realize you could kind of do that stuff deliberately. Like it just seems like it just happens by accident. Oh, the culture in this organization isn't very good. Well, maybe you could change it. Because
Yes.
start to change language and ideas and challenge people, find influences and all that sort of stuff. So I just kind of wanted to, I suppose, close it up. I'm very conscious of that.
Just on that piece there, that final piece, there's a meme that was doing the rounds yesterday, which I ended up sharing in my group. And I spent a lot of time congratulating my group for sharing, the Facebook group for sharing the ideas and contributing. And the meme was, people, when they're in science fiction, worry about going back in time and making a minor change and causing a huge cascade into the future. Why don't you make that change now?
Yeah.
And it's just, a lot of what I try to do is to get people to think differently about something using a whole bunch of different storytelling techniques.
And if people are more rom-com rather than sci-fi, it's like Gwyneth Paltrow and sliding doors. That's,
That's the one. Yeah.
So finally, you are, I think, at great risk of being boxed in terms of only working in the diving space. You don't only work in the diving space, do you? And tell us a little about the work that you do and who you help in other spaces as well.
So actually, it's the same sort of stuff. It's about building effective teams, about decision making, about shared mental models, about psychological safety, just culture. So worked with, last week I was in UMet set in Germany. Tomorrow I'm doing a presentation for Netflix and doing some work in London. Technip FMC up in Aberdeen, software companies down in Portugal. So my sort of sub mantra is people are people. It's just the stories that change. And it's one of the key things that I do whenever I start the training is I collect 3 or 4 stories from the audience, which then allow me to anchor the theory and the practice into their stories as we go through. So I can go into pretty much most environments, collect some stories and understand how and why people behave the way they do,
Yeah.
and then make it relevant to them.
You use their material. I love it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's because they're the experts in their job.
Exactly.
I know very little about that, but I do know how people operate and interact together.
Amazing. I love your work. We're on a mission at Safety on Tap to help health and safety leaders and their teams be more relevant to their operations, more valued by their stakeholders, and more effective in influencing the health and safety of work. I'm pretty passionate about that mission. I love many other people who are passionate about their mission. So I'm glad to have come across you and your work and your generosity, and appreciate you sharing some amazing insights. So thanks for
Thank
joining
you.
on the Safety.
Thanks very much. And thanks, everybody. And yeah, looking forward to listening to all of the other stuff that you collect, Andrew. It's really good.
What did you take out of that conversation with Gareth Lock? I'd love to hear, and he would too. We'd all benefit if you posted a comment or a question or a reflection over at safetyontap.com/EP221. That's safetyontap.com/EP221. I personally reply to all your comments because I value hearing from you, and so do my guests. My reflections today are maybe what you might call reading in between the lines. It's not explicitly what Gareth had said, but what I found hidden in between what he said. So here's my 2 takeaways from that chat with Gareth Lock. Takeaway number 1. Gareth is not tied to a single discipline. He's a military guy, but he's not stuck in that mindset. He's a human factors guy, but embracing HOP, even though arguably it copies and waters down long-standing human factors work. He draws on insights from language and storytelling, sense-making, mental models, simulation, and digital technology. He is being professional by not being stuck in any single professional domain. How often do you find yourself stuck because you're just sticking with health and safety professional stuff? How often do you go outside or beyond health and safety to do your work? Takeaway number 2. Change must take into consideration the whole system you're working in. And I mean system as all of the parts of your context and how they're connected. Gareth realizes that the way that change happens in diving is very different depending on whether it's commercial or it's recreational diving. So he changes and adapts to suit. He also talked about how influencers, leaders, and first movers in the diving space have been critical to his mission and success, which reflects the social aspects of the system that he's in. How much time do you spend thinking about the system you are in all its facets? If you like this conversation, then here's a few more podcasts that I think will help you pull some threads that we talked about today. Speaking of the meaning of words and language, check out my amazing conversation with Adam Johns in episode 162. Gareth mentioned the usefulness of mental models to help people make sense of things and learn more and communicate better about mental models. There's heaps of insight into that in episode 197. And in episode 165, we explore how data fails to do its job when it's missing a story, and how storytelling needs to be a greater part of how we work. And all the way back in episode 4, we have the inimitable Dr. Drew Ray, who's talking us through how storytelling works in his work. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, what's the one thing you'll do to take positive, effective, or rewarding action to grow yourself and drastically improve health and safety along the way? See ya.